So I had the group on valuing outcomes for intervention, and that was Steve Ellis, and Damon actually had to run back. He should be back shortly. But I think for me, on the call prior to, as well as during this conversation, what this spoke to is we have a model, and everybody, as we went throughout the course of this two-day workshop, wish they had Steve in their on their panels every time they were getting ready to go and to do a cost-benefit analysis or benefit-cost analysis. And so it was really nice to walk through that model to see that there are standards out there already, right? So there's some standards that people are actually using to make decisions about how do you use this analysis appropriately, but also how you can save from it, as well as looking at, the fact, and this came up quite a time, about uncertainty. So if you do this, what can you lose in the process of doing it, but also what can you save? So that was very promising to me to actually see that, and he's right here, so he can chime in as well. But also that there are rules involved in doing that, and we talked about it a couple of times throughout. And Steve talked about it as a trumping rule and how you make a decision whether to include outside data versus not. And what didn't come through probably in the presentation was, so there's a computer analysis that allows you to do that kind of thing. So there's a specific way of doing it, and I think that could be part of a consensus process of how do you develop that and scale that up for things here also at the federal level, because I think as we heard in the last panel, this is really a complex process, and that also came out in Damon's talk. Damon talked about all the complexities that are involved in prevention and intervention research, and a lot of questions that are left unanswered versus things that you can actually answer. The next piece that I thought was important, and Hank brought it up, but Steve did as well, was having a way to report that's consistent, and that gets back to something that the last panel talked about. So reporting something in a way that's consistent across all of the things that we do, and that's that apples to apples approach, so then you can actually compare those things. So I think as we go forward and we think about consensus, it's not only in doing the analysis, but also you reporting out that data and how that can happen so that you can compare across. The thing that captured my attention, though, is that Steve started out talking about where he started, which was a problem from the policymakers. So the policymakers come to the table with a problem. How do you deal with childcare? And so then that's where the Policy Institute starts. And what I wanted to add to that mix is, so where do you start with the scientists so that they can bring in the cost benefit from the very beginning? And that's something that Margaret talked about. So again, as we were thinking through it or talking about it, how do you include that in the discourse? Where do you come up with the plan to say, from the beginning of the inception of the research, to get that on the table, that the researchers would actually think about cost-benefit analysis as opposed to maybe including it at the end of the journal article as a second thought. So that's sort of the things that I pulled out of because again, he was much more articulate about his own approach than I am. But I think you all get that. Damon's, on the other hand, started off by talking about that there's no real clear standards for monetizing program effects and evaluation and prevention and intervention research. So that's a place that we sort of need to come together with, of thinking through, well, where's the consensus around that? How would you actually do that? Then, if you're looking at it, there's no consistency across methodologies, across the studies for prevention and intervention studies. So again, that's something that you would need to bring to the table. Very hard things to do, but at the same time, I think worthwhile discussing. Then how do you link program effects to eventual economic benefits? That's a less direct conversation. And so again, as we think this through, where can we have some consensus around those issues, particularly around children, youth, and families, and particularly around early childhood? The next thing is that, if you're looking at economic evaluation plans, you have to first focus on expected program effects in general, and then next on the economic value that's attached to them. And again, that varies across different people and places. And again, Steve brought that up in his talk as well. What he was doing for Washington State. So then, how are you going to take that and scale that up across different locales? And I think that that's important for us all to think about. That's where you get back to context. Context matters. Even the last presentation around policy, Head Start programs are varying to the degrees that they vary, so it's not all just Head Start, it's all these other things that are going on. So we need to think about context. Then the qualitative pieces around that as well. So if you're going to bring in qualitative research, what's the standards around qualitative research? Maybe it's not just taking that one person and bringing them into the field. Maybe it's, okay, so what's acceptable what's the level of acceptability for what you'll include as the qualitative research? And I think that gets back to what we talked about earlier. The same standards we want for quantitative, I think we also want them for the qualitative approach as well. And then the non-cognitive skills came up, and I think that they came up for lots of various reasons. How do you value social emotional development? What does emotion regulation mean? What do those things mean? How are you going to add a monetary value to that? And Damon brought that concept up because as we think about cost benefit, all of those domains are specific, particularly for children, and I would argue birth through third, so you don't really want to leave that off. What does that mean? How do you add a value to that? So I raised those as combining what they talked about, but also some of my thoughts around that.